For your new book, Next, you interviewed more than 100 people on how to go about career and life transitions. And some of them included James Patterson, who is a best-selling author now, but previously was an advertising executive. You found some common patterns amongst them. Can you talk about the biggest ideas and lessons that you share in the book? And I want to build up to a lot of things you say, but I want to start with the punchline. What did you find about people who were successful at the career transitions?
Sure. So what Next is, I should say, for those who haven't read it yet, is it's a deeply reported guide to navigating change in how we live, how we work, how we lead. And as you mentioned, I spoke to these hundreds of people as well as the experts who study the process of change. So I looked at career changers, but also people who came back from failure or had life-changing aha moments and or came back from trauma. And so I spoke to the experts, which included people like business school professors, but also neuroscientists who study creativity and what happens when you have an aha moment, what happens to your brain, and psychologists and other experts in the process of change. And what was fascinating, as you just referenced, is that when I spoke to all of these people and all of these experts and you sort of synthesize what they are telling you as they walk you through the process of a successful reinvention, they use different words and the academics use different terminology, but they're all talking about exactly the same thing. They're talking, I call it the Reinvention Roadmap, and it's 4 steps that take you through pretty much every successful transition will pass through these stages.
Okay. Can you, I want to dig deep into the 4 steps. Yeah, briefly. Yeah, tell us about that.
The 4 stages are, the first is search, then struggle, stop, solution. And very briefly, so search is your first step when you're collecting information, you're collecting experiences. You don't necessarily know that it's going to lead you to a transition, but it will ultimately prove incredibly important, valuable, and lead you to some perhaps unexpected place. The struggle comes in this next step is when you start to disconnect from your previous identity. You haven't quite figured out what the new one is. It's very uncomfortable, it's miserable, and in stories we tell of great reinventions, we tend to leave this step out because we don't like to talk about it. Very often, that step does not end until you reach the 3rd stage of a transformation, which is the stop. So the stop is something that either is imposed on you, like I lost my job, or like there's a pandemic, right? It's something that pulls you out of your routine. It could also be something you choose, like I quit my job. But whatever it is, it pulls you out of your routine, and only then do you get the perspective and the ability for all of this other information and experiences that have been floating around and, torturing you. They can coalesce into what ultimately leads you to that 4th and final step, which is the reinvention, right? So that's your solution.
So it's search, struggle, stop, and reinvention.
Yeah, solution is the 4th. Yes, we keep it to the S's. Yes, we do.
Awesome. Yeah. So I wanted to, before we dive deeper into these 4 aspects, wanted to understand your own career and life transitions. Your bio was full of different things you've done. So tell us more about how your own career transitioned and what led your transition from being a journalist to a best-selling author. How did that happen?
Sure. So first of all, I love this question because I asked the same question to everybody I interviewed, like, how did you get from there to there, right? And the answer I have is very similar to the answer that they gave me. This is so funny because I do not see myself as anything different. I am a journalist. I have been a journalist since the start. I started, in college as an intern at the Wall Street Journal, joined the Wall Street Journal, spent 22 years there, went on to Condé Nast, became an editor-in-chief, went on to Gannett as an editor-in-chief, and I'm writing books and I'm teaching journalism. But writing books is journalistic. I mean, I write nonfiction books. I'm not writing like romantic, bodice rippers. So to my mind, it's very organic, from one step to the next. And, and what's interesting is the people who I interviewed for Next had similar self-perceptions. So in other words, for example, there's one of my favorite guys I talked to. He started out as an economist at JP Morgan for 30 years in New York and London. Today, he's a cattle farmer in the Hudson Valley in New York. And you look at that and you say, what? But when you talk to him, Will Brown, I love him, when you talk to Will, he will say to you, I'm still the same guy. I'm using the same skills that I have always used. Running a farm is, I'm putting into, you've got to figure out your budgets, and you got to figure out your supply chain, and you got to figure out, all of your operations. And he said it's the same skills. He just gets to apply it in a different way to this new career. And I think that I see myself similarly. And also, a lot of the people who I interviewed as well did end up not with that goal in mind. And I think you've talked about this in your own career, right? Not with that end goal that I have to be this, but that your interests and your experiences end up leading you somewhere that might actually be unexpected. So, so in my own career, I went through all of those stages multiple times, which most people do. And sometimes the stop was something that I chose for myself. Like, I spent 22 years, I loved the Wall Street Journal, but I had an opportunity to start a new magazine at Condé Nast, which was amazing. So that's something I chose. But we started this new magazine in 2007. We had great coverage leading up to the financial crisis, but at the end of the day, the financial crisis also killed the magazine. So I ended up with a stop that I certainly did not choose, which was suddenly my magazine is gone. And I had to kind of rethink, and that helped me to kind of reset my own expectations and my own thought process about sort of where should my career go from there.
Right. So I wanted to dig deep into the first step of the journey that you talked about, search part. I think that is probably the hardest for most people, because there is this conflict between what the heart desires versus what the market demands. I mean, should I choose the best paying career, or should I go with what my heart is leaping to do? What's your advice for that? How do you make a decision? Is it random or is it, do you advise people to really think through deeply what's going to be the valuable skills? There's so many dimensions to search.
What you're describing is actually more like struggle. I mean, the search is very often unintentional for people. So the search might be that you have an interest, that you have a hobby, that you have a side hustle, or that you're realizing that what you are doing every day is not the most fulfilling thing, and you start doing something else in your spare time. I mean, there's a great example. There's a guy named Kay High. Camarena he started out, with his goal being, I'm going to be a managing director at an investment bank. And at a young age, he actually achieved that. But he realized it was not very fulfilling. So in his spare time, he created a newsletter essentially just for his friends, where he would just pick out sort of interesting articles. He would curate things that he was interested in and send it out to some friends. And it grew and grew. He was searching without actually knowing where he was going. But today, that newsletter has turned into a full-time business for him. He was able to leave the investment bank and become full-time as a newsletter curator and coach, essentially. But again, it was something, he was dissatisfied. The search, though, was something that he wasn't intending for that to be a career. It was something he started to, again, have this experience and a hobby, essentially.
So by search, do you mean searching within oneself? What is more fulfilling? What gives you satisfaction versus what can pay you the most? Yes.
So search is definitely about the process of the search at the beginning is really collecting, I should say, lots of different inputs and information. It's both your internal thought process, but it can be things that are not connected. It can be, you're interested in, this kind of book that you're reading, but you're also interested in this kind of hobby that you're doing, but you're also kind of not satisfied with your job, and you're thinking about, like, what might I like to do professionally? You do not see the connection necessarily in the search. That's what's kind of interesting about it. And also, because it can be unintentional, what I found is that a lot of people who are struggling with work, and this should make people feel a little better, very often people are further along than they realize in their transition, because they have almost unconsciously begun to collect and curate this information. They just don't know yet what they're going to end up doing with it. I mean, this is a not on careers, but in terms of in life, there's actually fascinating research that finds that, for example, couples that eventually get divorced, they start decoupling without even realizing it. In that very first stage, there are things that they are doing that they are not even aware of that start to decouple them. So in the same way, if you're going to be leaving your job or transitioning to a different job, new career even, you're going to start to that decoupling, and you're going to start, collecting this other kinds of inputs that are eventually going to help lead you.
So you make up your mind subconsciously way before it bubbles up to your consciousness, where
Well, it's not that you've made up your mind, it's that you're collecting subconsciously. You're collecting a lot of information that you're not yet connecting. It's,
right.
The very famous Steve Jobs quote that says, you can't connect the dots going forward, you can only connect them going backwards. That's what you're doing in the search. You're collecting the dots. You just don't know how they're going to come together yet.
Yeah. So Joanne, a lot of people define their self-identity by the kind of work they do. Does that not make search process hard? And what advice you would have for people to think beyond? If I'm an investment banker, there's so much of pressure to be an investment banker. How do you even cultivate thoughts and hobbies beyond that?
That's a great question, because you're right that self-identity plays a huge role in the book. It plays a huge role in all of our lives, and particularly, in high achievement professional careers, which I imagine is most people who are viewing and listening to this. Our self-identity is very often our job title. And it's very, very difficult to break away from that or to leave that behind. But there are a few things that you can do. I actually have in Next, I tease out a dozen different strategies to work through this entire Reinvention Roadmap. But the very first thing, one of the very first things that people can do is a phrase I'm borrowing from psychology called possible selves. So the idea of possible selves in psychology is how we think of our future selves, that it's either things that we hope for, maybe even things we fear. It's how we might envision the future. It goes beyond daydreaming, and this is the key, because we might be an investment banker and say, I want to do something else, but that's sort of your daydreaming. I want to be an opera singer, whatever, right? Possible selves takes you beyond that. Possible selves is when you start to visualize it, to feel it, to imagine what it would feel like, and then to actually map out the steps to get there so that you can figure out, is this realistic? So that is kind of a first step for people to do that. And then another step that I think is really important, another one, that I borrowed this one from trauma psychologists, but one of my very favorite steps that people can do, because it's very helpful, because we tend to get lost in our own heads and we cogitate a lot, and it doesn't help us very much, because we're just stuck in a rotating maelstrom of ideas in our heads. So there's a phrase that trauma psychologists actually came up with. It's called an expert companion. So in trauma psychology, the expert companion is someone who can work with a survivor, listen to them, and reflect back to them sort of a more realistic perspective on where they are and progress they've made, etc. I feel like we all need an expert companion, and that expert companion is somebody who knows you, who can reflect back to you your strengths as well as your weaknesses in a realistic manner to give you perspective. The reason this is so important is because we all have innate talents that we may not even recognize, and if we do recognize them, we may really diminish them because we feel like, yeah, everybody can do that. It comes easy to us, so everybody must be able to do it. And so we don't have a great self-perception of ourselves. And that is something that an expert companion can reflect back to you, and that helps you focus what your future may hold.
So is this expert companion usually a friend, a mentor? And if you approach someone, what sort of questions should you ask?
Sure. So your expert companion can be a coach, like a career coach or a therapist, but very often it is a friend, could be a relative, a colleague. I tell the story about my own expert companion, who's my husband, when I was really struggling with, as I said, I was at the Wall Street Journal for years, very happy there, no intention of leaving. When Condé Nast, Cy Newhouse, who owned Condé Nast, approached me about creating a new business magazine for Condé Nast, and it was really exciting, but I struggled because I didn't want to leave my previous job. And it went on for 2 months. I was like paralyzed until my husband actually said to me at one point, he said, when you talk about this mythical, non-existent magazine, I can see your body language changes. I can see your affect changes. I see this excitement in your eyes that I don't see when you're talking about your current job. And it was such a light bulb moment for me. And the key is about the expert companion, it's just what he did, which is he didn't give me advice. Your expert companion doesn't tell you what to do, but your expert companion can reflect back to you things you're not even seeing in yourself. And for me, by the way, that literally was the moment after 2 months of paralysis where I said, okay, now I know, like, this is what I'm going to do. It helped me to make that decision on my own.
Right. I also wanted to build on possible selves that you talked about and how is it different from daydreaming. Can you give an example to really make this idea concrete? What does it mean to imagine possible selves?
Yep. Sure. So a great example is James Patterson, the novelist, the huge best-selling fiction writer of our all time, I think. And as it turned out, I actually met James Patterson for the first time more than 30 years ago. I was a young Wall Street Journal reporter covering the advertising industry. I went to go write about the Burger King advertising campaign, so I had to go to talk to the guy who ran the Burger King ad account. And it was James Patterson. He was an ad guy. He worked in an ad agency. And I remember because I went to go talk with him early one morning, and he started out the conversation talking about how he had been up for hours already because he was working on a book, because he really wanted to be a writer. And he actually gave me a book that he had published, and I don't remember the details, but I dug up the Kirkus review of that book, and it called it abysmally dumb. I mean, he was a struggling writer, let's put it that way. And of course, he went on to become like the best-selling author of all time. So I went back to him and I said, how did you get from there to here? And he walked me through the stages, but the first thing he said to me was, I didn't see myself as an advertising guy. I always saw myself, in my mind, I was a writer. That's a great example of somebody who has grabbed onto that possible self, and then he did what you're supposed to do, which is he took action. While he was at the ad agency, he wrote books, many of which were not successful, but he kept trying. He was trying to figure out what his voice was. And so he didn't just kind of think about it, right? He went out and honed that possible self and worked it till he kind of could make it to take it, his now self as an ad guy, to his future self as a best-selling writer.
Right. Yeah, it's crazy how identities can trap us or liberate us. I just remember I was never into fitness. I wouldn't exercise, and I never imagined myself to be a fitness person. That was not my identity. And the crazy thing is, I think it chained me. It is a self-reinforcing thing where if I don't imagine myself to be interested in fitness, I would never be interested in fitness. But once I started saying that I'm a fit person, even if I never went to the gym, I just said I need to go to gym. So it's just super interesting to me how identities impact behavior.
Okay, can I tell you something? I love this so much because I literally just yesterday was reading an academic study about possible selves that was talking about you, basically. It had people envision themselves in the future as a future self. They did this exercise, and one group was told to envision themselves as a healthy exerciser. The other group was told to envision themselves as an unhealthy couch potato. They came back later, like weeks later, and they found that both groups were exercising more. And the reason is, as I mentioned, possible selves can be your hoped for self, like yours as an exerciser, but it can also be your feared self. Your feared future self is a couch lug potato, and you're unhealthy. And both of those are motivators. Possible selves are closely related to motivation. It is what helps us get off the couch. So you are a perfect example.
Fantastic. So let's say the search phase is over and now you want to struggle. What exactly is struggle? Is it really making peace with the fact that you need to change?
Yeah, struggle is hard. Struggle is when you're disconnecting. You've made the decision, right? So maybe you're that investment banker and you're not loving your job, but you're not hating your job. But struggle is when you're like, okay, like I've got to move away from that, right? You're disconnecting from your previous identity. The problem is you haven't figured out your new identity. So the struggle phase, it's uncomfortable and it can be miserable. Like I said, we don't like to talk about it. I mean, and the problem is particularly because we feel like it's very lonely and we feel like we are the only person going through it. I call this the Cinderella myth because if you think about it, you know, we're from birth, like there's Cinderella transforms to a princess or the frog turns into a prince. And then you're an adolescent and you know, it's all about Spider-Man and Superman and Batman. And then you grow up and you turn on the TV and you're looking at American Idol or Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. All of these stories that are just fed into us our entire lives are about instant transformation. And we feel if we don't hone to that, if we don't have instant transformation, there's something wrong with us. And we feel like we have a problem and everybody else is on some sort of glide path to success except us. So it's very lonely. But here's the thing, and I want every listener or viewer to understand this, is it's really important. The struggle phase is very important. Tons of important work is getting done during this period, and you may feel, and almost surely will feel, that you are standing still or spinning your wheels, but in fact you are moving forward. And we all go through it. So you're not alone. If you're going through it, you are not alone, because everybody does. But it's hard, and it can last for quite a long time. You know, I mean, for some people, it could just be a matter of weeks, right, where they're trying to figure this out. But there are people for, you know, it takes quite a while. I mean, there's one of my favorite examples in the book, a guy named Chris Donovan. I love this guy. He was a telephone repairman. He grew up in a working class family where you get a job. You don't have a career, you get a job. And so as a teenager, he started working for the phone company, and he did for years. And all during that time, he had a secret hobby where he would design and sketch out designs for shoes, which he thought was his own little hobby, but not like something he shared with people at the phone company. But it wasn't until he reached his 30s that he finally shared those designs with his now husband, who said to him, you know, you actually have serious talent. And he went through that struggle phase because he was like, but I got a job, like designing shoes is not a thing. But I have this job. Like, he struggled for it for quite a while until his stop came when he was 50 years old, so after decades at the phone company. At 50 years old, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. And that was the moment where he had to step back and say, life is too short. I was put on this earth to design shoes. And when he recovered, which luckily he recovered, he took early retirement. His husband, they'd been saving to renovate the kitchen. His husband said, take the renovation money and go back to school. And he did, and he went back to design school. And today he has his own shoe line. He was named Best New Designer by Boston Magazine. He's in Boston. And he was, at that time, I believe he was 61 years old, named Best New Rising Designer. So it took him quite a while. Whereas there are some people, by the way, younger people, the younger we get, like as you go generation by generation, the younger you are, the faster the turnaround is. And we see that, you know, millennials only spend 2 years, 9 months on average on a job. Gen Zers now, it's 2 years, 3 months. So it gets faster and faster as people are turning. And also the younger people there's more of an expectation that they will have multiple jobs. And add to that, we now have a much longer runway, a career path. For kids coming out today is more like 60 years as opposed to when I came out, it was, you know, the idea was you work 40 years, you hit 65 and you quit. Now there's a much longer career path, lots of room for reinvention.
So again, I want to dig down into this younger versus older dynamic. Is there an optimal way to think about career when you're young versus when you're old?
Yeah, I think, so here's the key, and I saw you put a question out on Twitter, and there was somebody who actually referred to this idea because, and I've had this question when I do public events, how do you appear for a younger person? How do you have these different transitions without looking like a dilettante, like you're dipping in and you're just flighty? And I think this is really, really important. The idea that when I spoke to all of these people who had these successful reinventions, it was organic. They were not dilettantes. It wasn't that they were saying, I'm a banker today and tomorrow I'm a farmer. These were people who could explain in a way, and in real life, it truly was organic. It wasn't that they certainly dropped one identity and picked up another and then dropped that one and picked up another. Everything was connected. And it was fascinating to me. There was a woman I spoke with who I profile in the book named Catherine Finney. She started as an epidemiologist. She gained accidental fame as she was known as the budget fashionista, and she would go on TV and tell you about the awesome cheap shoes she found at Target and what a great bargain it was. And today, she is an investor and an advisor to Black-owned, Black-founded technology companies. Now, when I spoke to her, I'm like, okay, I cannot imagine 3 different careers. And she said, yeah, but it was all organic. One thing literally led to the next, And she described how that happened. And she's right. So you want to have continuity, not necessarily the same profession, but continuity in terms of your career arc.
So the key is not to optimize for job changes, but to see things organically where they lead. And if that includes job changes, then it makes sense. But you can't sort of start a job and say, I'm going to change it 2 years. That doesn't make sense.
No, though it is true that, younger people, and there is a reason why they change jobs more quickly. I think older people had an expectation of a long career, and you could, if you graduated in the 60s, 70s, 80s, you could expect that you could join a company and essentially stay there for life. You can't make that, nobody can make that calculus anymore. And so there is a real reason why people do switch jobs, because employers do not have the same loyalty to their employees as they once had. And so employees do not similarly have the same loyalty to their employers.
Yeah, that makes sense. In almost all your stories so far, it's curious that everyone had a hobby and that transitioned into the next career. So, any thoughts on that? Is it important to cultivate hobbies? Because I know many people just give up on hobbies that are not too important. They are toys. It's something you do on the side. But if they are to become stepping stones for your next ladder in career, then you ought to give them more respect than most of us end up giving.
Yeah, that's true. It doesn't have to be a hobby, though, right? Mm-hmm. Hobbies are great. Actually, taking a break I have an entire chapter on all of the research and how important it is to actually step away from your career, to take a break. It helps with creativity. It helps you generate new ideas. It helps your mental health tremendously. So all of those things are important. And so a hobby is a great way to kind of get your brain space out. But that's not necessarily the case, because the people who I interviewed, there are all kinds of ways that they made those transitions. And, some of them were for example, here's a classic example is Alan Greenspan, the former Fed chief. So Alan Greenspan, not a lot of people know this. He actually started his career as a professional jazz musician. He initially did not go to college. He went to Juilliard to study the clarinet. And he became a professional jazz musician. Most people don't. And in fact, because I had interviewed him about this, and he told me that he was actually sort of an unexceptional student in high school, except for math, because he liked math. And he really wasn't college bound. He loved music and he loved baseball. Those were his things. And baseball he loved because of the math. He loved the stats. But so he went to Juilliard. He was playing professionally in a jazz band. And he told me that on the breaks, he would do his bandmates' taxes. And then he started, during their breaks, he started reading books for fun, because he was sort of nerdy, and the other bandmates would go, get high in the green room, whatever. And he would sit there and he would read books. And because of the math interest, it led him to be interested in these kind of financiers, and he would read books about them, and he became really intrigued. And he told me that at some point he became more interested or more engaged in his breaks. He looked forward to that more than the performance. And that's when he said, I think I need to go back and go to college and see if I can get some kind of job in finance. It wasn't a hobby. It was an interest that he'd read about. It wasn't anything he did other than had an interest in math and reading and reading about finance. So it wasn't a hobby. It was but it was an interest that led him to say, okay, I got to try something else.
Got it. So Joanne, for many of these people that you're talking about, they knew what they were interested in sort of like the search phase, maybe subconscious signals. But many people are like, I'm unhappy at my job, but I also don't know what to do with my life.
Yes.
Do you have you interviewed people like these, or what's your advice to people who don't know what to do with their life? I know it's a very heavy question. Almost all therapy is founded on probably answering this question, but what did you discover about this question?
Yeah. I did find this is why that search phase that we're talking about is so important. And it is sort of tuning in to this idea of your possible selves. It's this idea of, I also say, I call it move before you move, which is don't just quit your job because you don't like your job. Like, do not do that. And also don't quit your job and say, I'm going to quit my job today because I'm going to be that opera singer tomorrow. Like, don't. Just no. So it is an iterative process. It's iterative. So if you don't know exactly what you want to do, first of all, you're not alone at all. And this is actually part of the process, is sort of taking small steps and trying something else. And you do it if you can afford to do it while you are still in your job. In other words, if you haven't been fired, stick with your job and you can experiment to try and figure this out. This is also why an expert companion is helpful. Example of an expert companion. Okay, here's a great example. Danny Meyer. So Danny Meyer he's now, you probably know, he's a very famous restaurateur, and he also invented Shake Shack, and he's highly successful as a restaurateur. He kicked around. He was doing like some sales jobs. He didn't know what he wanted to do. And he did that for several years out of college. And the only thing that he liked was in this sales job, he would go around and whatever city he landed in, he'd want to eat, and whatever, he'd want to try out the local cuisine. Like, that was the main interest in his job. But he really didn't know what he wanted to do. And so he said, okay, I'm going to go to law school, because like, what else, right? And the night before he was going to take the entrance exam for law school, he had dinner with his uncle. And his uncle, his expert companion was his uncle. His uncle said to him, why are you going to law school? Like, what do you think? You don't, and the uncle said, you know what? Since you're a kid, all I see in you is food. Like, you love food. Have you ever thought about opening a restaurant? And Danny Meyer told me, until that moment, no, it never occurred to him. Like, it just was not a thing. He said, I literally could not see that if not for my uncle kind of, putting that in front of me, like, as a real possibility. So I do think like those kinds of things are really important. The other thing, and this is another one of the strategies that I reference, because this is something that we think we kind of intellectually know and we almost never do, which is reach out to weak and dormant ties. So your weak ties, people you don't know that well, like, let's say I want to work at Google. I don't know anybody there, but my husband's brother's sister-in-law worked there, right? That's your weak tie. Dormant ties, perhaps even more powerfully, people you've lost touch with. Somebody from college, somebody you used to work with. Here's the thing. So if you're not sure, if you're struggling, or even if you're thinking, I don't want to be a banker anymore, maybe I want a creative job, I want to do something else. Like, you reach out to these people for advice, and this larger network is far more likely to both give better advice, fresher advice, and surface more opportunities for you than your immediate close ties. Because your close ties, we all sort of are in a bubble, and we all know the same thing and the same people and the same ideas, and you can really refresh your thinking by going outside of that group.
Yeah. So on the question, what should I do if I'm not satisfied in life? I think I remember someone gave me advice that really stayed with me. And that person said, don't run away from something. Instead, run away towards something. And it was so powerful that running away from discomfort when you don't know where you're headed is simply going to be chaotic, and it won't lead to anything. So I think your advice is spot on, that one needs to do a number of experiments to see what is that one interested in. And I'm sure everyone is interested in something.
Yeah. And again, it's iterative, right? These are not just kind of like a one jump. This is like that Cinderella myth, which we think we're supposed to know. This is the other thing, by the way, and of the people who I spoke with, I would say a plurality, and probably even a majority, didn't know where they were going to land, right? And I think this is another myth, right? That if you think about the books that we've all grown up, the business self-help books, Think and Grow Rich, it's almost been a century's worth of advice here now that's telling us, set your goal and then work toward it, like figure out every step to get to that goal. So many of the people who I spoke with didn't have that goal in mind, or maybe they had a different goal in mind. And I think this, again, it's a really damaging myth because it makes us think if we're struggling in a career and we're not sure where we want to go, again, we panic, right? Oh my God, there's something wrong with me, everybody else knows. But in truth, most of the people who I spoke with, they ended up somewhere different than they expected. So it's really important to have, first of all, have an open mind when you're going into this. It may not be where you think you're going. Another really great example, Len Elmore, who people probably remember from his great career as an NBA player with the Knicks and with the Pacers. So he was a great player, NBA player in the 80s. And afterward, he actually went to Harvard Law School. And, he worked as a lawyer, but he also worked as a sports commentator. And, he had a variety of interesting jobs. And then at the age of 65, he had a heart attack. He lost his job as a commentator. Like, he just had this whole bunch of horrendous things happen to him where it was, and he's 65, where other people are like, well, just retire, go have a nice life, right? And he's like, but he had so much to offer. But what he did, and this is so important, what Len told me was, what you need to do is he laid out his skills on a piece of paper, essentially. And he said, I want to open my mind to how these skills might fit in somewhere. He had a very open mind about how you could apply those skills. And he's currently now a Columbia University professor, and he teaches sports management, but also sports activism, which is something that goes way back to his childhood when he was really, he grew up in the 60s and was really interested in the civil rights movement. And now he's a college professor teaching these topics. But again, it's not like he ever grew up saying, I want to be a college professor. It's what he realized is he had this set of skills that he could use to fit into a whole other unexpected career. And I think a lot of people have that as well. And so when you're talking about people who don't know exactly what they want to do, take an inventory of your skills. They probably do fit more than one type of profession.
Right. So, Joanne, I'm not sure if you interviewed people from cultures where there's a lot of societal expectations to conform, especially in Asian cultures where you're expected to behave a certain way, do a certain career, and these career transitions, they're very hard because it's a very close-knit society with your parents, your relatives, your wider, just culturally, you're not expected to make these transitions. Yeah. Say even in Japan, if your family does a certain thing, you're expected to do certain things. So did you come across certain people who broke outside these culture set boundaries?
Yes, and I intentionally look for people like that, like Kei Hai, who I mentioned earlier, who's from East Asian background, whose parents were first generation. He's first generation. Parents were immigrants, and there was this expectation. He said that his entire life, you got to go to the best schools, you got to go to the best college, you got to get the best job, you have to be first to get managing director, and he, in lockstep, he achieved every single thing. And he told me, every step of the way, he thought, okay, when I get to that, when I get into Yale, that's going to be it. When I get to Blackstone, that's going to be it. When I get to be managing director. And he said with every step of the way, it was it just didn't do it. It just didn't do it for him. And it was really, really hard for him, as he said, to break away from the expectations of his family, of the cultural expectations, his own expectations. And so, in his case, what he talked about, he said he had multiple expert companions. He worked with coaches, career coaches. He worked with a variety of different kinds of coaches, actually, to help him to kind of rethink his own expectations for himself and to help him sort of plan and execute sort of an exit plan. And what he did was, in his case, he wanted to save up enough money so that he could have a couple of years of cushion, which he did. And then he really thought about what were his priorities in life. And his priorities were, he was married, he had young kids, his family, as surfing, loved surfing. That was a priority. And, having this sort of creative outlet, he wanted to be more creative than he was able to be. And so, he loved doing this newsletter that I talked about. It's called Rad Reads. It's really good. I recommend it. And so what he was able to do was to leave, to then end up, he moved to California where he can surf. And he scheduled his, he had to plan it all out, but he's able to schedule his life around the family, like, breakfast with the kids, get them off to school, go surfing, then do his newsletter. And he's been able to, build a business. Now, he had to rethink his own concept of success. I think that is the big issue for a lot of people, is rethinking success. Let me tell you one other thing, because I think this also plays into what we're talking about, which is how you think about, going back to self-identity, how do you think about yourself? So if you're thinking about some sort of new career. Like I was talking to somebody who was in finance who said they want to be a writer, and they said to me, they asked the question, at what point can I say I'm a writer? Because I feel like I have that imposter syndrome. And my question was like, have you written anything? And they're like, no. I'm like, okay, you're not a writer yet. But once you start to write, and you don't have to be paid for it, this is such an important point. You don't need to be paid for it to be a writer, right? There's a lot of places you can write, whether it's on LinkedIn, you can publish articles, or Medium, you can publish articles. You can create your own newsletter on Substack. You don't have to be paid to call yourself a writer, but you do have to write. And there's another great example of this, and I love this so much. I learned a lot from this woman, Jane Veron. So Jane, she had an MBA and a high-power corporate career, had 3 daughters, young kids. She was living in the suburbs, and she couldn't handle like the commute and the travel and all that kind of stuff. So very reluctantly, she quit her job, which she did not want to do. She left the corporate world. And as she said, it was really hard. She said it was 12 years of just feeling invisible. But during that time, she kind of threw herself into civic things and the PTA and the zoning board, all that kind of stuff. And at the end of 12 years, her first child went to college, and that was her stop moment. Jane said, I need another chapter. She couldn't go back to that corporate world that she'd left behind. But what she did instead is she created a nonprofit using all of the experience that she already had and her knowledge of her community. And what she did is she got volunteers, other moms like herself, primarily women who had a lot of business skills but were not in the paid workforce. These volunteers work with local business owners, primarily women and people of color, to help them, mentor them, advise them on, finance and marketing and balance sheets and all that kind of thing. So it's this wonderful nonprofit. It's called the Acceleration Project, of which she is now the CEO. So she's now a CEO. She's also, after that, she was elected mayor of her town. She's the mayor of Scarsdale, New York. She is awesome. But what Jane said is she tells her volunteers, do not call yourself a volunteer. Do not diminish the work you are doing just because you're not getting a paycheck. The work you're doing is professional work, and you are a professional. You are an advisor. You're a consultant. You are a professional. And I think that's really important just in terms of identity and understanding. Don't diminish what we do, Don't diminish yourself.
Yeah. I derive 2 sort of actionables from it. One, really what you talked about is the success criteria. I think defining that is extremely important. But again, success criteria is not something that's set out there. Like you said, one isn't an artist when one starts displaying her work in an exhibition, but an artist is when one starts creating art. And I think that differentiation is very important. And words have such powerful impact that the way you define, if you say I'm doodling, you'll end up doodling. But if you say I'm an artist, I think that gives you so much more power.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. That was the case with the shoe designer, right? He was doodling pictures of shoes for ages until he said, I am a shoe designer, right? Like there's a whole different way of how you perceive yourself. And too often we discount, really important qualities and skills that we have, right? And it's funny because you said I'm a former journalist. I'm not a former journalist. I am a journalist, right? It's all about like what your identity is.
Yes. So we talked about search, struggle. What about stop and solution?
Yeah. So the stop is really interesting because, you kind of need the stop. One of the really fascinating parts of the stop that when I first recognized this was really important was actually from neuroscientists who study aha moments. And they were explaining to me, there's these wonderful guys who have kind of pioneered this, John Cunios and Mark Beeman. And John Cunios, who I spent a lot of time with, he explained, and they have a wonderful book called The Eureka Factor, which I also recommend. But what they walked me through was the way that you have an aha moment is you collect information, that's the search, right? And it may be unintentional information. but you can't actually come up with your aha moment. Like you might focus on a problem, right? You might say, oh my God, I need to solve this crossword, or I need to come up with a slogan for this, whatever it is, right? Like you're focused on a problem, you can't solve it. And it's only when you step away, when you're taking a shower, you're exercising, you're sleeping, that's when you get the aha moment. And it's because you have to turn off your executive function of your brain, like that frontal part of your brain that is corralling all your thoughts and putting guardrails along your thoughts. You got to turn that off, and then what happens is all of these disparate pieces of info floating around in your brain can come together, and then they emerge as this new idea. And it emerges for you as an aha moment. But in fact, basically your brain has been working behind your back in putting together subconsciously all this information, and it emerges. So that stop, that's how it works in an aha moment. But in life, it works because for a similar reason, is that you are pulled out of your routine, you're pulled out of your normal way of thinking, and that is what allows your brain to put together these things in an entirely different way. So, a great example of that is genesis of Post-it notes, right? Was an aha moment. There was a guy named Spencer Silver. He was a chemist, and he came up with a new kind of adhesive. He couldn't figure out what to do with it. Nobody could figure out what to do with it. It was kind of temperamental, and for years he was kept trying to get people to figure out something, and nobody could figure it out. And then there was another guy, Art Fry, who worked with him at 3M, and Art Fry went to one of Spencer Silver's presentations, couldn't figure out what to do with this weird adhesive, and Art Fry sang in church, and during church service, when he had his songbook, and he had bookmarks in it, and the bookmarks started falling out, and he's like, I need something that will stick to the page and not rip the page. And he's like, oh my gosh, I can use Spencer Silver's adhesive, because you can pull it off. Like, this is one of the things, it sticks to a page and then you can pull it off. And so at first it was going to be bookmarks, and then he realized you could turn it into notes that you could stick onto pieces of paper. That was the genesis. But again, he came up with it in a church service, it was rehearsal, it was choir practice.
But do you have to necessarily wait, because it can take an infinite amount of time? Is there anything you can do to perhaps get to a stop or a conclusion sooner? Can you force it, or do you have to just create space?
Yeah. Well, okay. So you have to create your distraction to do it. So, this can happen during a day, or it can happen over a longer period of time. So, there was research that's done on chief executives who were able to take a sabbatical, and when they came back from a sabbatical, this is like a period of months. When they came back, they had fresh ideas. They were able to, rethink and reorganize and have brilliant new brainwaves. But you can also do this in the course of your day. I talk about in Next, I talk about the 90-minute rule, which is one of my favorites. I live by this. And the 90-minute rule is that if you are focused on an assignment, on a project, on a problem, you focus on it with zero distractions for 90 minutes. But at the end of 90 minutes, you have to take a break. You must. It is, non-negotiable. And during your break, you can do whatever you want. You can eat, swim, exercise, whatever you want to do. Just don't work. And then you come back and you do it again. You can do this for no more than 3 times a day, 4.5 hours total, but you will get more done and have more fresh thoughts than had you sat at your computer screen staring at it for 12 hours. And I found this out the hard way, because the way I learned about this rule is because my first book, Next is my third book. My first book, I had horrible writer's block. I spent a long weekend. I remember it was 3 full days of staring at a cursor on a blank computer screen, total, not a word. And I was tortured, and I went from there. I was going to cover the World Economic Forum in Davos, and I was on a plane, and I found myself sitting with a guy named Tony Schwartz, who actually, Tony, side note, was the journalist who actually wrote The Art of the Deal for Donald Trump, and then emerged as a big Donald Trump critic. But anyway, Tony now he works with organizations on culture, and he's the one. He said, you do this 90-minute rule, and it will cure your writer's block. And sure enough, it did. Because when you have this 90-minute rule, it's no distractions, and because it's a self-imposed deadline, in my case, it's like, I just got to get to the end of this paragraph by the end of 90 minutes or this chapter. And it forces you to just get something down on paper. And then you take a break and you come back, and then it's suddenly you have fresh eyes. So that, and by the way, this is rooted in research. K. Anders Ericsson, who I would imagine a lot of people listening know, he was the professor who came up with the 10,000 hours rule that Malcolm Gladwell popularized. But if you look at that research, the 10,000 hours research, which was done, K. Anders Ericsson did the research on violinists, experts versus amateurs, and he found to be an expert you need 10,000 hours. But there were two other elements that Malcolm Gladwell did not talk about that were key, and one of them was the experts practiced for 90 minutes, 3 times a day, and took a break in between. And the 90 minutes were what he called deliberate practice, which is 0 distractions. So again, it's rooted in neuroscience.
Yeah. I mean, when you were talking about taking breaks, it reminded me of my own career transition journey, where I was the CEO of a tech firm, and pretty much like what you said, from a search perspective, these different ideas have always appealed me. But being a CEO, it was always about whether this is the job I must do or whether I should do something else. And I wasn't clear, so it was a very big struggle for me, what I should do. So what I did was to take a sabbatical. And when I came back to sabbatical, it was pretty clear to me that I didn't want to be the CEO. So I actually changed my role from CEO to chairman pretty much immediately. And without that break, I don't think I would have had that disconnection and mental space to be able to realize what I wanted to do next.
That's a great example, a perfect example, because that is exactly what happens. You had the ability to disconnect and to get perspective in a way where it's almost impossible to do that if you are just in the middle of something and just focusing nonstop, which is also why just even in a regular career, you want to take your nights, your weekends. You really do need that time away. It makes you better. There was research that was done on physicists and writers because they wanted to look at left brain, right brain. And they were asked to keep a diary of when did they have their best ideas, and then those ideas were evaluated, as was the time period. Pretty much none of them had their best ideas during the workday. Like, their best ideas were all, and not necessarily that they were doing anything fun. It wasn't like, I'm going hang gliding. Like, it was like, I'm cleaning my house, and I had a great idea. Commuting on the train, sleeping, showering, I dreamed it, right? It's you have to step away. They didn't have their best ideas at work.
Right. And the 4th step solution is just culmination of everything, where you finally decide this is it.
Yes. So the 4th step is when sort of everything kind of coalesces and you make that's where you actually make that pivot. And by the way, I think that most people will go through this process, the entire Reinvention Roadmap, all 4 steps, more than once in their life. And also, sometimes you go through a couple steps and you go backwards, right? For example, people who are trauma survivors, I profile a wonderful, amazing woman named Kay Wilson in the book who survived a terror attack where she was within an inch of death, a machete attack in Israel. And she barely survived. And I talked to her because she's amazing, because she was attacked by a Palestinian terrorist who just wanted to kill Jews. And if you talk to her today, she was able to come back. She can't go back to her old job. Like, she's got a lot of post-traumatic stress, as you might expect, but she also had what's called post-traumatic growth, where she now, among other things, she's paints these beautiful pictures. She also started a nonprofit to help Palestinian children. In other words, the children of her attackers. She started a nonprofit to help them. And, it's a remarkable thing. But in trauma, when you talk to trauma psychologists, they will tell you, like, the first step for them is the stop. It's the attack. It's the traumatic event is the stop. So it's not quite the same order. But my point being that the steps are the same, but, how you go through them can differ from person to person.
Right. So, Joanne, since we are at the end of our time, I wanted to pick up some of the questions that people on Twitter post to you. Sumit asks, how does one know that it's time to reinvent oneself?
Yeah. So I think that you'll generally move before you move. So I think by the time you actually come to a decision that you want to reinvent yourself, you've actually done a lot of the work. So, you don't wake up in the morning and say, should I reinvent myself? It's more that you go through this process where you get to pretty much you've gone through the search and you're probably in the struggle is the point where, and that's why it's really important to take some of the strategies that we talked about and to take action on it, because you can't just decide in your own head, I'm going to reinvent. You actually do need to take some sort of action to kind of test the waters, to iterate, to take small steps to figure it out. I don't think it is a light bulb that you just turn on.
Right. So if you're daydreaming, probably it's not the time. But if you've started taking some action, then maybe that's an evidence that you should probably are already thinking about it and you should go seriously about it.
But yes, you are correct about it's. This is not like you have to take some action. It's sort of like what I would refer to with the guy who said, I want to be a writer, but he hadn't written anything yet. Like, write something and then you got to take some steps.
Got it. Barb asked a question. I think you mentioned about it before, but I'm going to pose it anyway. How did the individuals you interviewed for their success stories deal with imposter syndrome when they were in the middle of the pivot?
Yeah, imposter syndrome is real, and women experience it more than men do, and it's hard to get over it, but one of the ways, actually, again, having that expert companion, talking about it, sharing your ideas. Actually, there's research that shows if you write down sort of what you want to be and what you want to do and you share it with someone else, you're more likely to achieve that goal. So, basically, again, it comes down to not just keeping it in your head, right? There are steps that you actually need to take. And that also helps give you perspective that someone outside of your brain can tell you, that this is a real thing. I do see that for you.
Got it. So Joanne, as a closing thing for listeners, I often talk about maybe an actionable information or actionable step they can implement right away. Almost like a challenge, almost like people do push-up challenge. I want to build that little challenge with you. Is it fair to say if someone has been thinking about a career change and daydreaming, maybe the very first thing they should do, maybe next 7 days, is to actually take one small step towards it, something concrete? Or is there anything else you would advise as a challenge or something which can be implemented right away?
Well, I like that advice to in the next week, you must take a step toward an interest, particularly a step toward something that you haven't explored yet, right? I think that's great advice. But I would also say something that people can do today, like now, is to reach to a dormant or weak or dormant tie. I would reach out to, I would say, and an easy way to think about this, and also really wonderful way to think about this, is think about somebody who's helped you in the past, who you just want to say thank you to. Gratitude is amazingly powerful for you and for that person, and also can reforge a connection that may end up helping you on your path. But it also, for mental health, it's amazing. I actually, this happened to me very, very recently. Someone who I worked with a number of years ago, actually out of the blue, sent me an email and said, I was just thinking about you because you really helped me. You probably don't even remember this, but you really helped me in this particular situation 10 years ago. And I tell you, I was walking around on air for the rest of the week about it. Was such a beautiful email, but also it was a reconnection with someone, and those are the kinds of things that can lead to really powerful new thinking, new opportunities, and also just great for your mental health. So reach out to somebody as soon as you finish listening to this.
This is fantastic. I think this is great advice, and nothing better than making up someone's day. Yeah, so Joanne, tell us how can listeners buy your book? Is it available on Amazon? Is it out? I think it's out yet, right?
Yes. So next, The Power of Reinvention in Life and Work. It is out now, just came out, and you can get it wherever books are sold. You can definitely get it on Amazon. I also recommend and love it when we support local independent bookstores, so you can ask your local independent bookstore to get it, and you can find me and reach me and find information about events and other things, and if you want me to come and speak to your organization, you can reach out to me at joannelipman.com.
Great. We will link that in the descriptions, and thank you so much once again. So many wonderful advice, full of inspiration. Thanks, Joanne, for taking time to speak with me.
Thanks for having me. It was a really great conversation. I appreciate it.